Now strangers from the internet are standing outside. The strangers from the internet have come from far and wide. But I cannot receive them. I hardly believe in them.
Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome back to Shadow Yaddo. I'm Elena Richardson. If you're already part of our Yaddo community, chances are you've heard of Pat Towers. Maybe she cleaned you out over a poker game, or you attended one of her fabulous and infamous parties, or perhaps you've enjoyed her company at a Yaddo event. But if you're new to Yaddo, it's a true pleasure to introduce you to Pat. It's a long story, but she's actually the galvanizing force that brought me to this wonderful place. She's a long-time member of Yaddo's board and a beloved editor and friend to many writers. Pat was one of the founding editors of the relaunched Vanity Fair and worked for several publications, including the New York Times Book Review, Mirabella, 7 Days, as well as Elle magazine and Time magazine back in the good old days when they had a cart that delivered daily martinis to the editorial staff. And in case you've been living off the grid, which I guess was true for many of us last year, and you don't know who David Sedaris is, here's a little taste of how he summed himself up when he first applied to Yaddo back in the mid-1990s. David Sedaris, my brief biographical note. I was born in Johnson City, New York, and attended public school in Binghamton until 1963, when IBM transferred our family to Raleigh, North Carolina. I graduated high school and thought it might be a good idea to spend a few years having the kind of adventures people whisper about. Having no personal experience with adventure, I was sent immediately to Western Carolina University, a small, heavy-drinking college in the mountains. In Oregon, I picked apples and pears, then back to Raleigh, where I washed dishes and pursued my art career. Pursuing an art career in Raleigh is akin to pursuing skiing in Fort Lauderdale. I moved to New York and took a job as an elf at Macy's Santaland. My sister Amy and I had written and performed plays in Chicago, and we continued that practice here. A national public radio producer called. I'm on once a month now. Little Brown published my book in June and signed me up for 2 more. I can't account for all the luck and opportunity I've been handed. Well, we feel lucky in celebration of David's new book, a greatest hits collection called The Best of Me, to bring you this conversation. We asked one of his most insightful fans to check in with one of her favorite writers. Here's Pat and David.
I'm so moved by this book and by a lot of pieces in it, but the whole sense of your family just reminds me of mine, because somehow we moved at a certain point and we seemed to be other, outside people, or we had our own inside space. You have that wonderful thing where you said something like, I've often lost faith in myself, but I've never lost faith in my family and my certainty that we are fundamentally better than everyone else. I love that.
Well, gosh, first, I don't think I meant any individual member was better than everybody else, but I felt like as a unit, we were better than everybody else. I just felt like that they were squares. And when we went to their house for dinner, if you were invited to somebody else's house for dinner, you know, the things that they talked about were so, well, I don't know another word for it, square, you know?
Yes.
And their lives were so, I don't know, they just seemed like everybody else's life. And it's one of those things when you're in your own family. Like I was said to someone the other day, he was talking about his parents, and I said, God, your parents are so extreme. And he reminded me that when I was a boy, I said that I had a stomach ache, and my father said, well, you probably have hemorrhoids. And that must have happened 6 times, all during my boyhood, whenever I said I had a stomach ache. That has nothing to do with hemorrhoids. And what 8-year-old gets hemorrhoids. When I was growing up, it could be Tuesday in July or, a Saturday in November. It didn't matter. We would have dinner at the table, and then my father would leave the table, and the rest of us would sit around until 10, 10:30, 11 o'clock at night, just laughing and with my mother. So when I think of my childhood, that's what I think of. And you said something about being outside, and I think we moved to North Carolina from New York State when I was in second grade. I started the third grade in North Carolina. But at the time, Raleigh, North Carolina was really a southern town. I mean, everybody had an accent, and the newscasters had an accent. But then IBM and Westinghouse moved the offices down there. So there were whole neighborhoods built for Northerners, transplanted Northerners. And I'd never thought of myself as a Yankee, but suddenly you were called a Yankee wherever you went. People heard your accent, and then you Yankees who come down here and ruin everything. And so I think that kind of set us apart in a way and made us feel like we were on someone else's territory and pulled us close in a nice way.
Yeah. Did your mother tell stories, or you just were funny back and forth that made you laugh?
My mother was a storyteller. I mean, that was her thing, was telling stories. And she would have an altercation, or not even something would happen, let's say at the gas station. And then she would tell us about it. And then she would get on the phone and she would tell a friend, and it was a little different. And then she would call another friend. And by that point, the things that she wished she had said, she actually said. And by the end of the day, it was really polished, and it was a really great story. And as children, we thought, wait a minute, that's not how it happened. But then we thought, well, that's a really good story. I've never been one to say, that's not true, that didn't happen.
I had such a sense of your mother from all of the things you've written, but that next to last story, incredibly good story, and was very moving to me. But also what I love about your mother is when you started telling stories, she would say, oh, you might leave out that bit, or she was editing you. And so that too, she was helping you hone your own stories.
Well, I was talking to someone not long ago, and it was a parent, and she was saying, oh, my son is turning out to be like a really bad storyteller, and he tells me things, and my mind wanders, and I feel like I shouldn't say anything to him about it. And I said, actually, I think you should, because you're only going to be helping him out. And just say to him, look, that's a first draft, what you just gave me, but you're adding all sorts of things that don't really contribute to the story, so you need to learn to cut those off. So, and my mother was really good at pointing that out, and I guess my feelings should have been hurt, but sometimes I think I don't really have feelings, like I don't, not like a regular person, at least. Often when people, say that they were hurt or offended by something, I can't begin to imagine why they took it personally. There just wasn't time for that. When you got 6 kids, so your feelings get hurt, so you feel neglected, so you didn't get all the attention you wanted today. Well, there's always tomorrow.
That's true. Well, one of the things that fascinates me about when I'm reading you, I get this sort of zing, this little electric shock I get from time to time. I mean, I'm thinking, now, what is it? It's recognition. It's a little bit of horror. It's relief that it's not me on the griddle. But of course, it's all of us. It's our foolishness and our fears. It's a lot of cruelty in it. We're indicted, but you actually indict yourself. That wonderful story, The Motherless Bear, wonderful dark story. Like you go, oh. At the end of that story, which I'm not going to say in case somebody hasn't read it and wants to read it, but it knocked me over practically. You got all these letters of people being upset, I gather.
Well, what was odd about it was that it's so clearly a fictional story. It's a talking bear. But I've never gotten more angry letters from people than from that story. And again, I couldn't figure it out because it's clearly fiction. Clearly fiction. It takes place in an imaginary world, and a woman got terribly upset, an English woman in particular. I mean, she was one of many. who said, "How dare you mock these intelligent and sentient creatures?" As if bears knew they were being made fun of. And it wasn't even making fun of all bears. It was just one bear in particular.
Right. It was one bear in particular. But it was after the bear's mother died.
All of those stories, it was a collection of stories that I put out called Squirrel Seeks Chipmunk. And they were all pretty short, none of them, a few of them were over 8 minutes long. But for every one of them, I took an aspect of myself that I hate. So I was writing about myself in each one of those. Yeah. Like sometimes somebody dies and you're like, okay, you really need to shut up about that death. You really do. And so I always felt like I talked about my mother dying too much. And so I just turned myself into a bear and made fun of myself. So if anyone's feelings should be heard, it's mine, not a bear's.
I know. And you have this extra thing that you do as a writer because you take your writing out into the world and your person by going around talking to audiences. Do you get surprised often by audience reactions, or do you kind of know, or does it vary enormously? And how are you doing without the audience now?
I remember once, and it was years ago, I just moved to France, and I was writing something for This American Life. And so it was a monologue that I wrote, and it was all about a woman who's just obsessed with games, right? But I made up all the games, and I made up all the terminology. And it came from reading the bridge column in the New York Times. I don't know anything about bridge, and it's just funny to see the terms. And so I made up all these terms for card games and yard games and stuff. And I didn't realize when I wrote it that the audience would sit there thinking, wait a minute, what game is that? Do I know that game? Wait a minute, if that was the score. And so they couldn't follow the story, right? But I didn't know that until Ira told me, that the story failed because people were sitting in the audience trying to do that. And that's one of the reasons I read things out loud on stage, is so I can determine that, right? And sometimes you realize, oh, they're not with me. But I won't, there's so many things I've written since this all started, and I have no idea whether or not they're any good because I can't try them out in front of an audience.
This traveling around, do you find the audiences very different in different places?
They're different in different countries. Like British people will stand in line an hour at a time. If I do a show, I sign books beforehand because I like doing it, and then I do it afterwards. So I might get people standing an hour before and an hour later. They'll answer your questions, but they're a little bit standoffish. Mm-hmm. Whereas an Australian won't wait in line as long as an American will, but an Australian will tell you anything, like especially money related. They love talking about how much they paid for their house, how much it's worth now, how much they make per hour, how much they make per year. Happy to talk about it, which I love that.
Yes.
I just really appreciate that. Like in Australia, the minimum wage is $25 an hour, and if you work on a Sunday or a holiday, it's up to $35 an hour, which, I don't know, I love knowing that.
Yes. We have to mention, I'm just fascinated by the animals in your stories, but particularly the turtle. The turtle that appears in different occasions, the snapping turtle and your sister's turtles. When I was growing up, I used to visit my Aunt Carlotta in the city, and she lived in a women's hotel. And down the hall was this woman, Eva, who was Russian, who worked for Hattie Carnegie. And she had a turtle, and I'd be, say, like 9, 8, 9, 10. I'd have to go visit Eva, her turtle, whom she called Gropi. And she fed him hamburger and canned peaches. She had a little aquarium. and she would reach into the aquarium and get him out for me and put him on the floor and say, now, Gropi, come on, dance for Mama, dance for Mama. And he'd do this wiggle. And then she'd pick him up and hold him on her shoulder, and his little head would come out. And she'd say, kiss Mama, kiss Mama. I was just mesmerized by it. So when I came across all the turtles in your book, I felt, oh, wonderful, someone else.
For some reason, I don't know, I think especially as I get older, I can write so many stories about turtles. And this summer, I was at the coast of North Carolina at Emerald Isle, and I found a baby snapping turtle in a parking lot.
Oh.
And it was just furious. And so then I started looking for a child. Not like a 5-year-old,
No.
but like a 12-year-old. I mean, if I was 12 years old and somebody said, you want this baby snapping turtle, I'd be like, are you kidding?
Yeah.
And it would just become my whole life, this baby snapping turtle. But in this day and age, you're a grown man with a baby snapping turtle and you go around looking for a kid, it looks bad.
It doesn't look good, no. Have you read anybody lately that you really liked and were responded to? Or who, when you were growing up and you started reading, who were you drawn to?
I mean, when I was a boy, I loved these orange-covered biographies of Daniel Boone and David Crockett and Abraham Lincoln. And, because of the time, they were all men, I think, in this entire series. But what I liked was that I loved reading about their boyhoods because they were going to be famous, but they didn't know it.
Yeah.
So they're there chopping logs and stuff, and I'm thinking, like, but you're going to turn into Daniel Boone, so all this is going to be worth it later. And then I didn't really start reading for pleasure until I was out. I dropped out of college, and I was living in a small town in Oregon, and I got a library card, and I started reading, Babbitt, things like that I was supposed to have read in high school. And then that's what kind of got me interested in writing. You know how you kind of read a book that you love, like Joy Williams, right? I remember so clearly discovering Joy Williams. And then I looked at the back on who blurbed her book, and then I read all of their books. And then I looked at who blurbed their books and read all of their books. And so it just... I just so clearly recall the feeling of leaving the library with a book that you'd been looking for. This was before you could reserve a book, which I don't know that I believe in reserving books. I think you should go down there and take your chances. But just that feeling of digging into a book that you'd been waiting for so long and just sort of slowly doling it out. Like there was a Lori Moore story in the New Yorker called FaceTime, I think, a couple months ago. And when I saw that she had the story in the New Yorker, I was like, okay, everything has to be perfect when I sit down to read this story. My house has to be clean and this, because I have a pretty good idea I'm going to be a different person after I'm finished with it.
Oh,
and I
that's
was.
Nice, yeah.
It was about coronavirus and somebody dying. That's what's interesting to me about this whole thing, is that we're all going through it. So on that level, everybody can relate to it, no matter where they live in the world. And it's pretty rare to have that story, because my dad's 97 and he's living in an assisted living place, and then he was diagnosed with COVID.
Oh, he was?
Yeah, and you know what? He got
that's
better.
Right, he beat it, yes.
It's not
I know,
fair.
extraordinary.
It's not fair.
Incredible.
One thing I just started, and I read it when it first came out in I believe it was 1978, William Maxwell's So Long, See You Tomorrow was serialized in the New Yorker. Gosh, I remember how moved I was by that story. And then I just found out he did an audio version of it before he died. So
wow.
And then I just read that book, Evicted.
Oh, Evicted, yes.
The interesting thing about Evicted was that I found myself siding with the landlords, which is sort of like watching Schindler's List and siding with the Nazis. I mean, but my parents and my grandparents were landlords. And so, when they would have tenants who would pour bacon grease down the kitchen sink, and then when the kitchen sink stops up, they pour it down the bathroom sink. And then they're like, call the housing board because their sinks are stopped up. And it's like, well, you put bacon grease down the goddamn sinks. It was interesting to read a book like that and to find yourself siding with the people who were supposed to be the villains. But it gave me an idea, and I thought, I've never really written about my parents, coming from landlords. And now I'm a landlord myself.
Mm-hmm. The other thing about your writing is its shock tactics and humor. I mean, the Motherless Bear being one of them. I mean, what is it that makes you laugh?
I mean, I'm often laugh at something that surprises me, I guess. It's something that's not, it's unexpected. Like if I'm reading something, quite often I laugh at a word just because I didn't expect that word, or I didn't expect to see or hear that. Like every now and then you'll read a word and you think, God, I didn't expect to see that word today. Like I haven't seen that word in so long. It makes you laugh. I mean, that to me, when I laugh at my own stuff, it's usually a word choice. Or anyone falling down. That's always funny.
Falling down is always funny, yes.
And that's what's been good about this snowstorm we had here.
Uh-huh.
The times that I have fallen down, I have to, I've said to myself, well, okay, I have to admit that was funny. Not to me, but I can understand if somebody wants to laugh at that. I have to say, you're right, that was pretty funny, me falling down.
David, I love talking to you.
Man, can I get a little scratch right there? Man, can I get a little scratch right here? Man, can I get a little scratch right there?
Thanks for tuning in, and big thanks to our sound engineer, CJ DeGenero, and to the artists who contributed music. In order of appearance, they are Joseph Keckler for the adaptation of our theme music, Strangers from the Internet, and filmmaker Boots Riley and his band, The Coup, for Wear Clean Draws from the album Party Music. We'll see you for more Shadow Yaddo in a couple of weeks. For now, stay safe and roll up your sleeve for that vaccine.